The woman in white. The rain poured heavily on the deserted highway, drumming against the windshield of Daniel Carter's 18-wheeler. His wipers struggled to keep up, barely clearing enough of the glass to see the endless stretch of road ahead. He glanced at the dashboard clock, 2:17 a.m. Another long, lonely night on the road. The radio crackled with static, and he sighed, reaching over to adjust the dial. No music, no voices, just the whispering hiss of dead air. He was too far from any town to pick up a decent signal. Then he saw her, a lone figure standing on the side of the road, barely visible through the sheets of rain. A woman, dressed in white. His hands tightened on the wheel. It wasn't safe for anyone to be out here in this weather, especially not alone. As he passed, the headlights illuminated her pale face, her long black hair plastered to her cheeks. She lifted one slender arm and waved weakly. A hitchhiker? Out here? Daniel hesitated. He'd always been wary about picking up strangers, but something about her. Maybe the way she stood shivering in the rain, or the desperate look in her wide, dark eyes, made it impossible to just drive past. He slowed the truck and pulled onto the shoulder. She approached cautiously, her bare feet making no sound on the wet pavement. As she reached the passenger door, he leaned over and unlocked it. "Need a ride?" he asked. She nodded, silent. Daniel hesitated. Something about her made his skin prickle, but he forced a smile. "Come on in." The woman climbed into the cab, her white dress dripping onto the rubber floor mats. The scent of damp earth and something else, something faintly metallic, filled the air. Daniel pulled back onto the highway. For a few miles, they drove in silence. The woman sat rigid in her seat, staring straight ahead. Daniel cleared his throat. "What's your name?" Her voice was soft, almost distant. "Lillian." "Where you headed, Lillian?" She turned to him, her dark eyes unreadable. "Just down the road." He nodded and focused on driving, but unease crept over him like a shadow. The cab felt colder now, the chill sinking into his bones. And then he noticed the mirror. The rearview mirror reflected the dark, empty road behind them. But not her. Lillian wasn't in the reflection. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. His fingers tightened on the wheel. He stole a glance at her. She was still sitting there, her face calm and expressionless. His heart pounded. What happened to you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lillian smiled, and then she vanished. The seat beside him was empty. The dress, the long black hair, the pale skin gone. Daniel slammed on the brakes, his truck skidding on the slick road. He twisted in his seat, his eyes darting around the cab. She wasn't there. But in the mirror, standing on the highway behind him, was Lillian, smiling and walking toward the truck. Daniel's breath came in short gasps. His hands were trembling as he gripped the wheel, staring into the mirror at the impossible sight. Lillian was behind the truck, standing in the middle of the highway, illuminated by the red glow of the taillights. She was still smiling. Daniel's instincts screamed at him to drive. He slammed his foot on the gas, the tires screeching as the truck roared forward. His heart pounded against his ribs, adrenaline flooding his veins. He didn't dare look back. Mile after mile passed, the rain hammering against the windshield. He kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see her again, but there was nothing, just the empty road behind him. His pulse began to slow. Maybe he'd imagined it. Maybe exhaustion was playing tricks on his mind. But then, the temperature inside the cab dropped. The air turned icy, his breath visible in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. A shiver ran down his spine, and then a whisper, soft, faint, coming from the passenger seat. "Why did you leave me, Daniel?" His hands jerked on the wheel. The truck swerved slightly before he corrected it, his throat tightening. She was inside the cab again. Lillian sat in the passenger seat, her wet dress clinging to her body, her dark eyes locked onto his. Daniel's mouth went dry. How do you know my name?" he rasped. She tilted her head slightly. "You picked me up. That means we're together now." "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "No, this isn't real. You're not." His words died in his throat as her reflection flickered in the glass of the windshield, just for a second, revealing what lay beneath the illusion. Her face wasn't human anymore. Her skin was gray and rotting, her eyes black pits of endless void. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of jagged, yellow teeth. Daniel screamed. The truck veered dangerously as he struggled to regain control. His foot pressed harder on the gas. The engine roared as the speedometer climbed past 80. She started laughing. The sound was wrong, like nails dragging across glass, like distant echoes in an empty room. Then pop, a violent jerk. One of the tires burst. The truck skidded out of control, metal screeching against asphalt as Daniel fought the wheel. But it was too late. The world spun. Crash. Glass shattering. Darkness. Darkness. A distant ringing filled Daniel's ears, like the echo of a faraway alarm. His body ached. The smell of gasoline and burnt rubber filled his nose. He groaned and tried to move. His hands were still gripping the wheel, but the truck was sideways, one side pressed against a tree. The windshield was shattered, rain dripping onto the dashboard. For a moment he just breathed. Then he remembered. His heart slammed into his ribs as his eyes darted around the cab. Lillian. She was gone. The seat beside him was empty. The temperature in the truck was still freezing, but she wasn't there anymore. Daniel fumbled for his seatbelt with shaking hands. He needed to get out. He needed to. A soft tap on the driver's side window. His breath caught. She was there, standing outside in the rain, her white dress soaked through, her long black hair hanging over her face. She lifted one pale hand and pressed it against the glass. Daniel's blood ran cold. He reached for the door handle, trying to force it open, but it was jammed. The truck's frame had bent from the crash. He was trapped. "Let me in, Daniel." Her voice was soft, almost pleading. "No," he whispered. "You're not real." A long silence, then a giggle. Not soft, not human. Something cold wrapped around his wrist. Daniel screamed. Her fingers, bone white and clawed, were reaching through the shattered windshield, gripping his arm. Her nails dug into his skin, ice spreading through his veins. She was pulling him toward her. He thrashed, his free hand scrambling for anything, his flashlight. Without thinking, he grabbed it and swung. The metal cracked against her arm. The instant it made contact, she let out an inhuman shriek, a sound that didn't belong in this world. Her grip loosened. Daniel yanked himself free. With a surge of adrenaline, he kicked the door open with all his strength. The metal groaned, then finally gave way. He stumbled out into the rain. His legs nearly gave out beneath him, but he forced himself forward, running into the dark woods. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to get away. Behind him, he heard her voice. "Daniel!" Closer. He ran faster. Branches tore at his arms and face. His lungs burned. The storm raged above, thunder cracking like an angry god. And then he saw it. A light, a small roadside diner, glowing in the distance. His last chance. He sprinted toward it, his breath ragged, heart hammering. Just a few more steps. A hand clamped around his ankle. Daniel fell hard. The breath knocked from his lungs. He twisted, kicking frantically, but there was nothing there. No hand. No Lillian. Just the dark, empty road. Shaking, he forced himself up and stumbled toward the diner. The bell above the door jingled as he shoved it open. Warmth, light, the smell of coffee and frying bacon. A few tired truckers sat at the counter. A waitress looked up, startled by his soaking wet, wild-eyed appearance. "You okay, Han?" she asked. Daniel's chest heaved. His hands were still trembling. He turned, looking back through the glass door, expecting to see her standing outside. But there was nothing, just the dark road, the endless storm. Maybe he was safe. For now. Daniel stood just inside the diner, his body soaked, his breath coming in sharp gasps. His heart still pounded in his ears, the terror of what had just happened clinging to him like a second skin. The waitress, a woman in her late 50s with tired eyes and a warm smile, frowned at him. "Han, you look like you've seen a ghost." Daniel let out a hollow laugh. If only she knew. "You need to sit down," she said, grabbing a menu and leading him to a booth near the window. "I'll get you some coffee." He nodded numbly and slid into the seat, his eyes flicking toward the road outside. Still empty. Was she really gone? A steaming cup of coffee appeared in front of him. He wrapped his hands around it, hoping the warmth would chase away the lingering cold in his bones. The waitress sat across from him, a concerned look on her face. Her name tag read Marge. "You crash out there?" she asked, nodding toward his disheveled appearance. Daniel hesitated. What could he say? That a ghost tried to kill him? That a woman in white had appeared, vanished, and then tried to drag him into the darkness? "I lost control of my truck," he finally muttered. "Tire blew out." Marge sighed. "That stretch of road claims a lot of people." Daniel looked up. "What do you mean?" She gave him a long, searching glance before leaning in. "You ever hear the story of Lillian Carter?" His blood turned to ice. "What did you just say?" Marge's brow furrowed. Lillian Carter, the woman in white. Daniel's hands tightened around the coffee cup. His last name was Carter too, but that had to be a coincidence, right? "She was killed on that road almost 50 years ago," Marge continued. "Hit by a trucker during a storm. Some say he didn't stop. Others say he did, but she was already gone." She shrugged. "Either way, she's been out there ever since." Daniel swallowed hard. "And she goes after truckers?" Marge nodded. "Every few years, we hear about someone crashing near the same spot. Some say they swerved to avoid a woman in white. Some say they picked her up, only to have her disappear." Daniel's stomach twisted. He had picked her up, and now she knew his name. Marge gave him a sympathetic look. "You're lucky, Han. Most don't walk away from that stretch of road." Daniel forced himself to nod, though his mind was racing. Why had she come after him specifically? And more importantly, was she really gone? A chill ran down his spine, because outside the diner, in the reflection of the rain-slicked glass, he saw her, standing just behind him, smiling. Daniel froze. His fingers tightened around the coffee cup, his knuckles white. He didn't dare turn around. She's not there. She's not there. But he could see her in the reflection. Lillian stood just behind him, her long black hair dripping onto the diner floor, her white dress stained with something dark. She wasn't moving, just watching. Daniel's breath came in short, shallow bursts. His heart pounded against his ribs. Marge noticed the change in his expression. "Han, you okay?" Daniel forced himself to look at her. His lips felt numb. "There's someone behind me." Marge frowned. "Sweetheart, there's no one there." His pulse hammered. Slowly, he turned his head. The space behind him was empty. No wet footprints. No shadow. Nothing. But when he glanced back at the window's reflection, she was still there. Lillian, smiling. Daniel shoved back from the table, the chair screeching against the linoleum. His breath came in ragged gasps. Marge reached for him. "Whoa, Han, sit down." "No, He turned in circles, scanning the diner, searching for any trace of her. But the only people there were the tired truckers at the counter and Marge. Marge gave him a long, worried look. "Maybe you should rest, sugar. Get a motel room for the night. Sleep this off." A motel. A room with a locked door. Walls between him and the road. It wasn't a bad idea. His hands were still shaking as he nodded. Yeah, maybe you're right." Marge offered a small smile. "There's a little place up the road. Real quiet. Nothing fancy, but it'll keep you dry. Warm. Safe." Daniel grabbed his wallet, left a crumpled 20 on the table, and walked out into the rain. The cold hit him instantly, soaking through his clothes. He hurried toward his truck, or what was left of it. The front end was smashed, the windshield shattered. The whole thing was totaled. Great. Now he really did need that motel. He started walking, pulling his jacket tighter around himself. The neon sign of the Silver Pines Motel flickered in the distance. It looked abandoned, but he didn't care. He just needed somewhere to hide. The Silver Pines Motel stood at the edge of the road, its neon sign flickering like a dying heartbeat. Half the letters had burned out, leaving only S for Pie, S-Mote, glowing in the rain. Daniel pushed through the glass door, a bell above it jingling softly. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the scent of old carpet and cheap air freshener. A battered reception desk sat against the far wall, where a tired-looking man in a flannel shirt was hunched over a newspaper. The man barely glanced up. "Need a room?" Daniel nodded, reaching for his wallet. "Yeah, just for the night." The man grunted, sliding a key across the counter. "Room 7, around the side." Daniel grabbed the key, hesitating. Do a lot of truckers stay here?" The man snorted. "Ain't much else out here. They stop in, sleep, and head out." "Why?" Daniel shook his head. "No reason." Pocketing the key, he turned and walked out, the rain soaking into his skin again. Room 7. It was at the far end of the motel, past a row of cracked doors with peeling paint. The fluorescent hallway light buzzed, flickering weakly. When he reached the door, he shoved the key into the lock and twisted. The knob stuck at first, but then it gave way with a dull click. Inside, the room was exactly what he expected: small, damp, with faded floral wallpaper curling at the edges. A single bed with a sagging mattress. A wooden dresser with a dusty TV on top. A cracked mirror on the opposite wall. Daniel shut the door behind him and locked it, twice. Then, finally, he let out a long, shaking breath. Safe. At least, that's what he told himself. The motel room was too quiet. Daniel lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the rain outside. Every now and then, the pipes groaned somewhere in the walls. The old clock on the nightstand ticked loudly, the second hand jerking forward in uneven bursts. His eyes drifted to the mirror. Nothing, just his reflection. He exhaled slowly, trying to convince himself that this was over. Maybe he really had escaped her. Maybe she had just been a hallucination, a trick of exhaustion and fear. He closed his eyes, and then, a soft drip. Daniel's breath caught. Drip, drip. It was coming from the bathroom. Slowly, he sat up. His pulse thudded against his ribs as he turned his head toward the half-open bathroom door. A shadow moved. Daniel went completely still. The light inside the bathroom was off, but in the darkness, he could make out something standing just beyond the doorway. Tall, thin, watching. The sound of dripping water filled the silence. Daniel swallowed, forcing his voice to work. "Hello!" No answer. But in the mirror, he saw her. Lillian stood in the bathroom doorway, her soaking wet dress clinging to her body, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her mouth stretched into a smile. The light flickered, and then she stepped into the room. Daniel's heart stopped. Her footfalls were silent as she stepped into the room, her form looming in the dim light. The air seemed to freeze, and for a long moment he couldn't move. His body was frozen in terror. Lillian's eyes locked onto his, dark and bottomless, pulling him in with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Her mouth curled into a grotesque smile, a smile that didn't belong to a human being. "You left me, Daniel," she whispered, her voice like the rustling of dry leaves, harsh and unnatural. Daniel could feel the chill of her presence invade his very bones, and his body finally screamed into motion. He pushed himself backward, sliding off the bed and scrambling toward the door. But when he reached for the handle, it wouldn't turn. Panic surged through him as he yanked the door again and again, but it was jammed shut. The metal was cold, unyielding. Her laughter echoed in the small room, high-pitched and sharp. "You can't escape." With a sudden burst of energy, Daniel turned and darted for the window. He tore open the blinds, only to see the pitch-black night beyond. No lights, no cars, no hope, just the relentless fall of rain. The floor creaked beneath him as he backed away from the window, his gaze never leaving her. Lillian stood in the middle of the room now, her head tilted unnaturally to one side. Her wet dress clung to her body, her face pale and lifeless. "You belong to me now, Daniel." Her voice was soft, but the words sent a shiver of dread through him. "No, no," he whispered, his voice cracking. You're dead." Her lips parted, and she stepped closer, each movement jerky and unnatural. The sound of her feet scraping against the floor was almost deafening. "So are you." Before he could react, she was on him. Her cold fingers gripped his arm with the strength of a vice, and her touch felt like ice burning into his skin. His stomach twisted. He fought to break free, but her grip only tightened. "You can't run from me, Daniel. You will be with me." Daniel gasped for air, his heart pounding in his chest. He struggled, desperate to free himself. His mind was spinning, his thoughts scattered. But then he saw it. The mirror. In the reflection, he saw something that wasn't there in the room. A shadow standing behind Lillian, looming taller and darker than anything he'd ever seen. His breath hitched, and then it spoke. "Let him go." The voice was deep, gravelly, like a growl from the depths of hell. Lillian jerked back, her grip loosening, and in the split second of freedom, Daniel wrenched himself free. His eyes flicked to the mirror. In it, the shadow was growing closer. The figure was shifting, its shape becoming clearer. It was massive, towering over Lillian like some dark protector. She turned, her eyes wide in fear, but it was too late. The shadow lunged, engulfing her in darkness, and she screamed. A deafening, shrill cry that echoed through the room. And then, in the blink of an eye, the room was silent again. Daniel stood there, his heart still racing, his chest heaving for air. Lillian was gone. The shadow faded into nothing, and the mirror was cracked. Daniel stood frozen, staring at the cracked mirror. His breath was shallow, every nerve on edge, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The room was completely still. The air had lost its chill, and the oppressive weight of Lillian's presence seemed to have vanished. But the silence was thick with something darker. His eyes darted to the cracked mirror again. He wasn't sure what he expected to see. Some lingering trace of Lillian, or perhaps the reflection of the shadow that had appeared and disappeared in an instant. But there was nothing, just his own reflection, pale and shaken. The silence stretched on. Daniel took a tentative step forward, his legs unsteady beneath him. His heartbeat was still hammering in his chest, the rush of adrenaline still clinging to his limbs. He reached out, trembling, and touched the cracked mirror. The glass was cool to the touch. He jumped when the door behind him creaked open. Daniel spun around, his heart nearly leaping out of his chest. There was no one there. The room felt emptier than ever before. The air had thickened again, a sense of unreality creeping into the corners of his mind. He backed away from the door slowly, still staring at the empty space. Something about the room felt wrong, like the world around him was shifting, bending. His chest tightened, and a deep, irrational fear began to rise within him. "Daniel!" The voice was faint at first, a whisper carried on the wind. Not again. He looked around the room, his breath quickening. The voice came again, this time louder, clearer. "Daniel, you can't escape me." He turned toward the source of the sound. It was coming from the bathroom. Daniel's feet felt as if they were cemented to the floor. He couldn't move. His gaze was locked on the dark doorway, where he could see the reflection of his own terrified face in the mirror. And then she appeared, Lillian. Her form stepped out from the shadows of the bathroom, her dress still soaked, her hair hanging in damp strands around her face. Her skin was pale, too pale, and the smile on her lips was twisted, full of malice. Her eyes, those eyes, were no longer dark and empty. They were filled with rage, a fury that surged from the depths of the grave. "You thought you could escape me, Daniel." Her voice was full of venom, the words dripping with hatred. "You thought this was over, but I never leave." Daniel stumbled back, his legs weak, but he found himself unable to tear his eyes away. Her presence was unbearable, like an invisible weight pressing down on his chest. The walls of the room seemed to close in, the floor sinking beneath him, as if the very motel itself was consuming him. I don't. His voice broke, but before he could speak again, Lillian moved. Her body was unnaturally fast, like a flash of lightning, and she was suddenly right in front of him, her cold hands grabbing his face, her nails digging into his skin. "I never leave," she whispered again, her voice low and cruel. Daniel gasped, his breath choking in his throat. He could feel the icy cold of her fingers digging deeper into his skin, his body growing colder with every passing second. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. Daniel collapsed to the floor, his body trembling, his hands pressed to his face where her icy fingers had touched. The air around him felt like it was spinning, as if the world itself had been turned upside down. For a long time, he couldn't move. He just sat there, gasping for breath, his mind a swirling mess of confusion and terror. What had just happened? Was it real, or was he losing his mind? But deep down, Daniel knew. Lillian wasn't gone. She was still with him. And no matter where he went, no matter how far he ran, she would always find him. Daniel stumbled to his feet, his body shaking uncontrollably. The room still felt thick with an unnatural energy, as though the very air was alive with malevolent force. His mind was spinning, trying to piece together what had happened, but it felt like there were too many pieces missing. He wiped his clammy palms on his jeans and stared at the door. He couldn't stay here. Every instinct told him to leave, to run as far away as possible. He couldn't face whatever Lillian was anymore. He couldn't understand why she was haunting him, why she had chosen him. But just as his hand reached for the door again, the lights flickered once, twice, and then everything went dark. The power had gone out. Daniel froze. The stillness of the room seemed to grow deeper, as if it was swallowing the very sound of his breathing. The darkness wrapped around him, suffocating him. And then, a soft whisper. "You can't leave me, Daniel." The voice was coming from behind him, so close that he could feel the cold breath against the back of his neck. He whipped around, his heart leaping into his throat. But there was nothing there, just the oppressive darkness, swallowing up the space around him. His mind raced. She couldn't be real. Could she? The door was still locked. The room felt smaller now, the walls pushing in closer with every breath. And the temperature had dropped. His skin was ice cold, and he could see his breath in front of him. Lillian's laughter echoed through the room. Daniel staggered backward, his feet hitting the bed, but he couldn't look away from the spot where he had heard her voice. "You think you can outrun me?" The words crawled under his skin, prickling his flesh with terror. He shook his head, backing toward the window. "Please, please, leave me alone." But when he reached the window, the cold air cut through the glass. He turned, gasping. Lillian stood there, her figure shrouded in darkness. Her face was half hidden, but the coldness of her presence was overwhelming. "I'm not letting you go, Daniel." Her hands reached out, long, thin fingers creeping through the shadows like something unnatural. With a cry, Daniel ran. He didn't care where, he just needed to get away. His feet pounded the floor, his legs moving on their own, instinct taking over. He burst through the door, into the corridor of the motel. But the hallway was empty, dark. The faint smell of mildew hung in the air. The walls seemed to close in around him as he raced toward the exit. He didn't look back. The moment his hand gripped the door handle, something yanked him back. The force was overwhelming. His body was thrown against the wall, his head smacking against the cold, cracked plaster. His vision swam, but through the haze, he saw her again, Lillian, her face twisted in a grotesque expression, her eyes wide and filled with a terrible rage. She knelt before him, her cold fingers wrapping around his throat. Her grip was like ice, choking the breath out of him. "You belong to me," she whispered, her voice low and deadly. Daniel gasped, his hands clawing at her icy fingers. He couldn't breathe, and then the air went still. For a moment he thought he had died, but then he felt the presence shift. It was like the weight of the world had lifted from him, and suddenly he could breathe again. Lillian's fingers loosened, and she seemed to fade away, like a ghost dissolving into the air. Daniel blinked, his head spinning, trying to understand what had just happened. Was she gone? Had she finally left him? But no, there was no peace. In the distance, he could hear her whisper again, low and breathless, like the wind itself was speaking. "You can't escape me, Daniel." Daniel stumbled back into the room, his mind a blur of fear and confusion. He slammed the door behind him and bolted it shut, but the sound of Lillian's whisper still lingered in his ears, echoing like a death knell in his soul. He didn't know how much longer he could stand it. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his pulse thundered in his ears as he backed toward the corner of the room, trying to distance himself from the door. The silence felt oppressive, pressing in from all sides. His eyes darted across the room, searching for some sign of movement, some indication that Lillian was still there. But there was nothing. Nothing but the eerie quiet and the feeling that something was watching him, waiting for him to make the wrong move. Then the lights flickered again, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. Daniel's heart raced, and he instinctively grabbed the edge of the bed for support. His whole body was trembling. A soft drip. The sound came from the corner of the room. Daniel turned his head slowly, his eyes locked onto the bathroom door. Drip, drip. The sound of water dripping from the faucet, just like before. But this time it felt wrong. Every drip was like a signal, a countdown to something terrible. His eyes didn't leave the bathroom door, but his mind screamed at him to run. The drip stopped, and then the door creaked open. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he watched, frozen in place, as Lillian stepped out from the shadows of the bathroom. Her face was horribly twisted, pale skin stretched too tight, her eyes wide with fury and malice. Her mouth hung open, revealing sharp, jagged teeth, as if her form was shifting, becoming something more monstrous. "You can't escape," she hissed, the words scraping against his eardrums like nails on glass. The room felt colder, the air thick with an unnatural chill. Daniel's blood ran cold as he realized she wasn't just haunting him. She was consuming him. He could feel it in his bones, the creeping sense of doom that was slowly swallowing him whole. His vision blurred, the edges of the room fading as if he was slipping in and out of reality. Lillian moved closer, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette whose strings were being pulled by something far more sinister. Her eyes glinted with an unholy hunger, and her fingers twitched, eager to reach out and pull him into the darkness with her. "You belong to me now." Her voice was low, barely a whisper, but it was enough to send waves of panic crashing through him. With every step she took, the room seemed to grow darker. The walls tightened, and the ceiling seemed to lower. He could feel the space around him closing in, suffocating him. Daniel's heart pounded, his mind racing for a way out. But the door was locked. The window was impossible to open. And Lillian, she was everywhere. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. And then, through the suffocating silence, he heard it. The sound of footsteps outside the room. Heavy, unhurried. Someone was out there. A faint hope sparked in his chest. But before he could even think to call out, Lillian let out a loud, guttural scream, her face contorting with rage. "No one will hear you," she hissed, her voice like a growl. "You are mine." Her hands shot out like claws, grabbing him by the throat. Her grip was like ice, suffocating him with every second that passed. But just as quickly, the footsteps outside grew louder. The door burst open. A figure stepped into the room. It was a man, a tall, broad-shouldered figure dressed in a dark coat, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat. "Leave him alone." The voice was deep, strong, and familiar. Daniel's mind couldn't process what was happening, but as the man stepped forward, Lillian recoiled, hissing like a wild animal, her eyes wide with terror. "You?" she whispered, almost as if she recognized him. The man's voice grew firmer. "Leave, now." Lillian's form flickered, as though she were losing her grip on reality. Her body began to dissolve, her shape distorting into something less human, more shadow than substance. With a final screech, she vanished, leaving nothing but a faint, lingering chill in the room. Daniel collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, his body shaking violently. He looked up at the man, confusion and disbelief flooding his mind. The man extended a hand to him, his expression unreadable. "Are you all right?" Daniel took the man's hand, still struggling to understand what had just happened. Who are you?" The man gave him a grim smile. "I'm someone who knows how to deal with her." Daniel's mind was still spinning, the events of the night too surreal to fully comprehend. He grasped the man's hand with a trembling grip, unsure whether to feel relieved or terrified. The stranger helped him to his feet, and Daniel looked around the room. The darkness was still thick, but Lillian's presence had faded, her cold grip no longer clutching at his throat. "Who are you?" Daniel asked again, his voice raw. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the corner of the room where the mirror still hung, its glass cracked but seemingly undisturbed. He seemed to know what it meant, his eyes narrowing. "I'm someone who knows how to deal with her," as I said. The man's tone was steady, but there was something dark in his eyes, a warning that made Daniel take a step back. "The woman in white," Daniel whispered, barely able to speak the name. How do you stop her?" The stranger's gaze flickered toward the door, his eyes narrowing. "You don't just stop her, you send her back to where she belongs." Daniel felt his pulse race as the man's words sunk in. He couldn't shake the terror that still clung to him. "But Daniel hesitated, looking around the room again, half expecting Lillian to reappear. "I don't know what she wants from me." "Why me?" The stranger's lips pressed into a thin line. "She was drawn to you. The energy, the emotions, people like you attract her. She feeds off of fear and regret, feeding off the living until she consumes them. Is there any way to stop her?" Daniel whispered, his voice breaking. The man turned to face him, his eyes locked with Daniel's. "There is, but it's not easy." He paused, his voice taking on a grim note. "You have to face what you've been running from. Only then can you break the cycle." Daniel stared at him, not understanding. "What are you talking about?" The man's expression softened, just for a moment. "You've been running from your past, Daniel. The guilt, the mistakes. She can sense that. And as long as you carry that, she will always find you." Daniel's stomach tightened. His past, his life, was a series of regrets he had buried so deep, he didn't even want to remember. But now, it was as if Lillian had dragged all those fears and mistakes back into the light. "You need to make peace with it," the stranger continued. "Only then will she be gone for good." Daniel looked at him, fear rising in his chest. "How can I do that? How can I fix all of this?" The man reached into his coat and pulled out something small and worn. He handed it to Daniel, a photograph. Daniel took it and looked down at the image. It was a photograph of a woman, her face soft and kind. She was smiling, standing in front of a house that looked familiar. "That was my mother," the man said, his voice quiet but tinged with sorrow. "She was the first to be taken by the woman in white. She left me, and I couldn't stop it. But I've been hunting her for years, trying to find a way to make her pay for what she did." Daniel's eyes widened as he looked up at the man. You're the one who's been hunting her?" The man nodded. "I thought I could stop her, but it's not about vengeance. It's about breaking the cycle." Daniel looked at the photograph again, a deep pang of guilt rising in his chest. His eyes filled with tears, the weight of his past crashing down on him. I don't know if I can. I don't know if I can ever forgive myself for everything I've done." The stranger's eyes softened. "It's not about forgiving yourself, Daniel. It's about accepting that it's a part of you. Only then will she have no power over you." For the first time, Daniel realized that he wasn't running from Lillian. He was running from himself. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," Daniel whispered, his voice shaking. "You don't have to be strong," the man said, his voice calm and steady. "You just have to face it." The room around them grew quieter, as if the very air was holding its breath. Daniel felt the presence of the woman in white, her presence, slipping away, and he realized, with a sudden clarity, that it wasn't just the woman in white he had to defeat. It was the fear that had been holding him back his entire life. "I'm ready," Daniel said, his voice stronger now. "I'll face it." The stranger nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "Good. It's time to let her go." And as Daniel stood there, the darkness in the room seemed to lift. The air cleared, and the weight that had hung over him for so long vanished. He felt lighter, freer than he had in years. The woman in white was gone, for now, but Daniel knew she would always be a part of him, just as the past would always be. But now he could face it not with fear but with acceptance. And he would never run again,